In June 2019, employees inside ARM's Cambridge headquarters received an internal notice telling them to pause engineering work tied to Huawei. Within a week, design houses across southern China felt the freeze arrive through their own contracts. The order did not come from a scramble in Beijing for some workaround. It came from a licensing clause sitting in a filing cabinet 6 time zones away, and that clause ended up building the very escape route it was meant to block. What follows traces that chain from a revoked license to a chip running today on an instruction set that nobody owns. A contractual lever in the United Kingdom reshaped China's processor roadmap more than any later tariff or blacklist edition did. That is the call worth making at the start, because everything downstream in this story bends back to it. Here is the chain, in order. Decades of borrowed architecture, a license that could be frozen, a pivot toward an open standard, a reversal of where the real workaround came from, and a software gap that decides whether any of it holds. For decades, Chinese processor design firms built their products on licensed foundations they did not own. Confirmed and well documented across the industry, fabless companies in Shenzhen and Shanghai paid Intel and AMD for x86 rights, or paid the company then known as ARM Holdings for core licenses, the same way a publisher pays for a translation. Phones, servers, and industrial controllers across China ran on instruction sets designed in California and Cambridge. That dependency was structural, not incidental. A processor's instruction set is the grammar it obeys, not the chip itself, and for most of the modern computing era, there were really only 2 grammars in wide commercial use, both licensed from a single publisher each, both with a publisher capable of refusing to print the next edition. That capability stopped being theoretical in 2019. Confirmed by contemporaneous reporting, after the United States Commerce Department added Huawei to its entity list, ARM conducted a compliance review and concluded that elements of its architecture licenses touched controlled technology closely enough to require a pause. Access to new core designs and updates became conditional on a government's restriction list, not on the terms a Chinese licensee thought it had signed. The chip ban that followed in the headlines was real, but it was downstream of this earlier event. The license clause is the single decision that reshaped the roadmap. A tariff adjusts a price. An entity list addition blocks a transaction. A licensing clause that can be invoked unilaterally changes what an entire national industry is allowed to build on, and that is a different category of leverage entirely. Facing that conditional access, Chinese chip makers and state-backed research bodies increased their investment in an open instruction set standard called RISC-V. Reported by trade press and confirmed in RISC-V International's own membership figures, the organization that stewards the standard counts thousands of corporate and academic members worldwide, with Chinese firms making up a large and growing share of new participation. Domestic semiconductor associations began promoting RISC-V as the default architecture for new low and mid-tier silicon, the kind that goes into sensors, controllers, and embedded systems rather than flagship processors. Shipment counts for RISC-V-based cores climbed sharply through the early 2020s, and design houses that once defaulted to a licensed ARM core for a microcontroller began reaching for a free specification instead. The instruction set itself, the open blueprint anyone can read and implement, carried no licensing office that could suspend it. That is where the expected story and the actual one split apart. Multiple governments hold real leverage over architecture licenses, the kind exercised through a compliance email or a contract amendment, but an instruction set standard published as an open specification has no comparable lever built into it, because there is no single license to revoke in the first place. Everyone watching the chip restrictions in 2019 and 2020 expected the workaround, if one came, to come from a factory floor. A new domestic fab, a smuggled lithography tool, a breakthrough at a Chinese foundry that closed the gap on its own. It did not come from a factory. It came from a piece of paper anyone can read, a published specification with no owner anyone could lean on to pull it back. That is an argument, and it deserves to be treated as one rather than as settled law. RISC-V. International relocated its governance structure to Switzerland specifically to insulate the standard from the reach of any single government, a hedge that only makes sense if the people running the organization believed the risk was real. But a hedge against an untested risk is not the same as proof the risk cannot materialize. No government has yet tried to restrict the standard itself in a real dispute, so the claim that an open architecture is functionally unrevocable has not been tested where it would matter most. There is a second gap sitting underneath the adoption numbers themselves, and it changes what those numbers actually mean. Most of the shipment growth analysts cite for RISC-V in China counts low-power cores embedded in things like sensors, smart meters, and microcontrollers, not the high-performance processors that were the original subject of the export fight. A surge in embedded RISC-V chips and a strategic substitution for a server-class ARM core are not the same claim, even though headlines sometimes treat them as interchangeable. The reason that gap exists traces back to how the two ecosystems were built. RISC-V's open core design spread fast because anyone with the specification can implement a core without paying a license fee or waiting for an approval. Reported across industry assessments and echoed in statements from chip makers themselves, what has not spread nearly as fast is the layer that sits above the core. The compilers, the operating system support, the debugging tools, and the deep catalog of applications already ported and optimized. ARM and x86 carry roughly 40 years of accumulated software work behind them, built by armies of engineers across thousands of companies, refined through generations of bug fixes nobody wants to redo. An instruction set is a grammar. A grammar published in the open is free for anyone to teach, to write in, or to build a new printing press around, but a shared grammar by itself does not write the dictionary's prose. Somebody still has to sit down and write every entry, and China is still in the middle of that work. Without mature compilers, reliable debuggers, and a deep base of ported software, an open core is a blueprint without a construction crew standing ready. That is not a footnote to this chain. It is closer to the link the whole chain hangs on now, because the instruction set was never the genuinely hard part. Writing an open specification and building silicon around it is a solved problem with thousands of working examples. Building the software ecosystem that makes that silicon usable for demanding high-performance workloads is the part that took ARM and x86 decades, with paid engineering teams at companies spanning the globe, and no open specification hands that work over for free. There is a third call worth making here because it is the one that explains why this story is bigger than China. The choice of RISC-V over a China-built proprietary architecture, an option state planners genuinely weighed, is what made this escape route usable by chip makers well beyond China's borders. A proprietary domestic standard would have solved the licensing leverage problem only for the country that built it, leaving every other firm exposed to the same kind of clause that hit Huawei. An open standard adopted at scale instead becomes infrastructure that European, Indian, and American startups can build on too, all of them facing the same incentive to avoid depending on a single license that a single government can suspend. The contractual lever pulled in London did not just push China toward an alternative, it pushed a meaningful share of the global chip industry toward one, so the chain holds at two levels and stalls at a third. It holds at the contract level. A license that could be frozen was frozen, and the freeze was real, documented, and consequential. It holds at the standard level. An open instruction set with no single gatekeeper genuinely cannot be revoked the way a license can, even if that protection has not yet been tested in a real confrontation. It has not yet been proven at the level that actually decides whether the substitution sticks, which is whether the software stack matures fast enough to support serious workloads before the next restriction lands. Adoption numbers measuring sensors and microcontrollers do not answer that question. Only the slower, less visible work of compilers and ported applications will. Trace it from the clause to the core. A license that could be frozen pushed Chinese chip makers toward a standard that cannot be frozen the same way, and that standard in turn exposed a different kind of dependency, not on a foreign company's permission this time, but on the unglamorous, years-long work of compilers, libraries, and software maturity that no open specification hands anyone for free. The clause got revoked. The grammar did not. But somebody still has to write the dictionary. Watch whether the next round of restrictions starts targeting the software stack instead of the architecture itself, or whether China closes that software gap first. That sequence, whichever comes first, is the marker that tells you which side of this chain actually wins. If you want the next link in this story followed as it happens, subscribe and turn on notifications.